So in this video, we're just going to look at some of the mods that you can do to your VR5 engine. Now, I've not worked on a VR5 engine. These are points that I've picked up over the years, or recommendations that our members or people that I've spoken to have made. So please feel free to add your advice to this. I would love to have a VR5 engine to work on, but they are as rare as hen's teeth, and my life is quite full at the moment, caring for relatives and just dealing with this channel and the day-to-day admin of running a business. But you never know, one day I might be able to get a VR5 project going, and that would certainly make an interesting feature for this channel. So we should say at the outset that the VR5 doesn't have a reputation as an economical engine. It really is a performance engine. The V configuration makes it relatively smooth, relatively powerful, especially compared to, say, a 4-cylinder engine. But there is that inherent weirdness about the engine that it's got an odd number of cylinders, and the intake and exhaust lengths are not balanced throughout the engine. So the VR5 engine is like every other engine out there in that it sucks in air, burns it with fuel, and then it spits it out of the exhaust. So if you can minimize any restrictions in the intake or the exhaust side of the system, you will increase the potential of making power on the engine. Now, I really do have to say, and people hate me for saying this, but it's a realistic view of modifications on the intake and the exhaust. On a stock engine with no other mods, you will not see significant gains. People quote about 7% of a power gain, and in reality you're not going to notice that as a driver. That's a similar difference to what you would experience driving on a cold frosty morning or a warm sunny afternoon. So you're not talking about significant changes in the power of the car, but it does open the way for you to add these other mods. If you start pushing your 200 horsepower engine up to 300, 350 or through the 500 horsepower mark, you're definitely going to start to see a restriction in the exhaust and in the intake. So fitting a cone filter on the intake, a freer flowing air filter, or even just a higher performance panel air filter in the standard airbox, you will go some way to mitigating those losses that you will get through the intake system. And on the exhaust system, it's generally the downpipes, the headers, the exhaust manifold itself where you see the restriction. And because of the unique design of the VR5 engine, there's a lot of debate as to whether equal length headers are effective mods and upgrades, or whether you should stick with unequal length headers. I tend to fall into the unequal length headers to just balance things out a little bit in the abnormal design. But your project and the person doing your project and tuning the engine will have a say in what works best, and they will work around this setup just to make sure that you get the maximum amount of power from it. If you go too large on the exhaust, you suffer from a problem with the scavenging effect. So that's where the exhaust pulses are coming out of the exhaust, and they actually create a partial vacuum behind them as they move past, and that partial vacuum can help empty the cylinders ready for the next air charge. So if the exhaust bore size is too large, the exhaust gases are going to flow more slowly, and you're not going to get that scavenging effect. And that's the reason why a lot of people lose low-end power when they fit a large bore exhaust system on their VR5 engine. So think carefully also about your power goal in your VR5 project, and bear in mind that a lot of VR5 engines were fitted in front-wheel drive cars. So at around 200 to 250 horsepower, you will start to get traction problems, and effectively you won't be able to fully use the power that you've got coming from the engine. If you've got a 4-wheel drive, a 4Motion, some sort of quattro system that's maybe been retrofitted in your car, you can certainly make use of the power, and that's what people tend to do on those higher power level projects. I have seen some very, very powerful front-wheel drive VR5s, and they are unusable off the line, but they're great fun once you get them going, and generally you can only use the power in sort of like the 4th and the 5th gear. So it's something to bear in mind when you have your project. It would be a shame to waste all of that money building a super powerful engine and then to find a problem with getting that power down. So one thing that can help you get the power down, other than really good set of sticky tires, is a differential. So the stock differential tends to give up the power quite easily to the wheel that's spinning the freest, and that can cause all manner of torque steer and traction issues. So fitting a torque sensing differential, some kind of limited slip differential, so the power is proportioned equally between the driven wheels, will just ensure that you're able to use as much of that power that you've got in your project. And think very much, rather than a peak power gain, think about the low end power, the overall torque curve. On the VR5, you just really want to bump up the power curve, particularly at the low end and the mid range as well. So I would say that's probably where it's lacking from the factory. So if you get the car mapped or specially tuned and you're doing other mods, that really is the area you need to focus on to get the maximum power from it, because that's where you're going to have the most enjoyment as a driver in your everyday commute. Obviously this is going to depend somewhat on how you use the car. If it's a track day car or one that you use in competition, you'll have a completely different set of parameters. But for most people watching this video looking to upgrade their VR5, they want a decent everyday driver that they can have a little bit of fun with, and they're not wasting extortionate amounts of money in order to achieve that. So the first big power mod that people might do to a VR5 to make those substantial power gains is turbocharging it, adding a turbo. It certainly is possible. There's a lot of work involved. It takes a lot of effort and calculation, and if you can buy a kit where most of that effort and calculation has been done already, you certainly make the job a lot easier. And there are some kits out there for the VR5. Please let us know in the comments if you found a kit or you've got a kit on your VR5 that provides a turbocharger, and just let us know what turbo units you found worked effectively and what that did to the overall power gains. The VR5 turbo kit I found raised peak power to about 550 horsepower. So I've seen people hitting 600 horsepower on most stock blocks without having too much of a problem. So these really are solid little engines, and they lend themselves nicely to turbocharging. The compression ratio is a little high. I think it was about 10:1 compression ratio. So you might want to put some sort of spacer on the head to just lower the compression ratios very, very slightly. In terms of turbo units out there, there's a few Garrett models that have been used. Some of the kits have options where you can just specify a different Garrett turbo. Now bear in mind, the larger turbines tend to have more lag at the low end, but they produce a lot more power at the top end. So for most everyday drivers, you can actually get away with a fairly small turbo, because the boost will come on quickly and you'll raise the overall power band rather than just at one end. So you've got the GTX 3070R, you've got the GTX 3076R, the 2867R and the 3071R. There's a 3582R, but I think that's just branded the GT 3572R, and you've got the GTX 2871R. So if you look up on the website you're buying from, you should be able to see some sort of flow characteristics or a dyno graph to just show what that does to the power, and choose a turbo that's appropriate to your project and your aims for that project. So in addition to the turbo, you will need to get the computer in the car adjusted or retuned or remapped. So depending on where you live, there's going to be slightly different names for this technique, but basically they download the settings in the computer and they adjust them. Now, even if you don't have a turbo, getting the computer adjusted, getting a tune dropped in there, getting it remapped and changed will enhance the power output of the engine. So on a stock naturally aspirated VR5, you won't see a massive top end bump in the performance you get after you've had it mapped or tuned, but you will notice a better low end delivery of the power. It does really sharpen everything up, and the ECU itself is just a great way of tightening up all the other mods. So that factory setting has been made quite conservatively with standard factory parts, factory injectors, factory intake and air filter and exhaust and everything. So if you've upgraded those components, you really need to get that adjusted in the computer so it can fully realize all of the power of those mods. So let me know if you've had yours mapped or tuned and what the end result has been to the drivability of your VR5, and if you recommend that to others. Let us know who did it for you as well, and the other mods that you've done. I love seeing people's build lists and the parts, and I'm sure with the VR5 community, loads of really friendly chaps out there, they'll all be really grateful to just see what you've done to your car and see what mods have worked best on it. The fuel pump is obviously something you're going to need to upgrade. If you're running that much more air into the engine, you need to match that with fuel. So I think the kit that I was looking at came with about 270 litres per hour fuel pump. The fuel injectors will typically be somewhere between 570 and 630 cc's. And these will just allow a better flow rate and a nice spray pattern, allowing that fuel to be fully utilised within the engine. You obviously need a boost controller. You don't want the boost on all the time or when you're off throttle, so there's a little bit of complexity in there, but there are mechanical electronic boost controllers that can be added to your kit or that come with the kit just to allow that to work effectively on your VR5 engine. The other thing you need is an intercooler, which typically mounts at the front of the car on the front of the radiator. So a lot of people have gone out and they've retrofitted them from other models. So the 1.8T came with quite a nice sized intercooler on most models. So your choice of model and the piping kit varies a lot depending on which car you have and what you're trying to do to it and where the turbo has been sited. But because of the relatively compact size of the VR5, it's quite easy to add a turbo. There's a bit of space in the engine bay. It doesn't require too much effort moving stuff around to get it all to fit. It makes sense to upgrade the pipework. Obviously the turbo's going to need a manifold. The intake pipes are going to need adjusting, and I would strongly recommend you get tougher intake pipes. The stock factory ones are probably going to split and the joints are going to suffer under the pressure of a turbo forcing all that air in. So upgrading to a hard pipe kit in places, although I've not seen any around for the VR5, let me know if you found some, or silicone hoses with decent quality clamps can make a world of difference to your project if you're planning to turbocharge your VR5 engine. So think about the clutch as well when you're tuning your VR5 engine. So the standard engine, I believe, had the dual mass flywheel, which just smooths things out further. You've got the V5 configuration, which is inherently imbalanced. They've done a great job at smoothing it out and making the power delivery nice, but the dual mass flywheel will absorb a lot of the shocks that the gearbox would otherwise take. So it's a good idea to keep the dual mass flywheel on these. If you feel differently, let me know in the comments, but you can get slightly lighter dual mass flywheels. I've seen those around over the years. I can't find any current suppliers, so let me know if you can flag something up for those. But you can also convert it to a single mass flywheel that is lighter. That will create a little more vibration through the transmission, so your transmission may eventually take a hit. So you just need to be careful with that. The big problem you've got with VR5 engines is generally finding parts. It is tricky. I'm really hoping that this video and the comments will build into a repository of information for other VR5 owners, so we can just pool resources and find the best places, the best upgrades and the best parts for your VR5. So camshafts in these engines can have quite a dramatic effect on the power delivery. You've got to be careful you don't go too aggressive because that'll affect the low end tick over. So the camshaft controls the opening and the closing of the exhaust and the intake valve. So that's really a big factor in how the engine delivers the power. A camshaft is something you would consider with other mods really. You certainly want to get the mapping or the ECU tune adjusted to take that into account, just to make sure that you're getting the maximum power from it. And generally a cam will bump up the top end power band and you might see a little bit lower end power decrease in some cases. It depends very much on the profile you go. I would personally just recommend a fast road cam profile. So you're looking at about 260-degree cam profile. The advantage is you get slightly more lift, which obviously could have other implications for the engine and the pistons. But you want to allow as much air into the engine as possible in order to burn the fuel and release that power. So with the VR5 engine, it's actually the ECU controlling the camshaft by means of an intermediate shaft. There's single chains for the camshaft drive and various tensioners in there just to keep everything running tight. Now there is a big difference in configuration between longitudinal and inline mounting of engines. So swaps between the two are really challenging because they've changed the layout of where the various ancillary bolt-ons on the engine are. So we're going to talk very briefly about individual throttle bodies. So a lot of people suggest these as good mods for all naturally aspirated engines. So in my research on the VR5, I've actually found that they're not really recommended. The problem is getting the ECU to accept different intake lengths and different runners and where you've adjusted that. So you're walking into a whole host of complexity. So most guys I've spoke to have just told me to steer well away from individual throttle bodies on the VR5 engine. They're a pig to set up. I'd love to know if someone has pulled it off and how they've done it. Aftermarket ECUs will obviously allow a little more flexibility when it comes to tuning and setting these things up, but because it's a 5-cylinder engine, you'll find that most of those aftermarket ECUs are geared up for even numbered cylinders, 4, 6, 8 for example, and very few few of them can actually handle the 5-cylinder. Let me know in the comments if you know of one that can handle a VR5 engine and just cope with all the complexities of that setup. I did find one from Fuel Tech that was quite an interesting proposition, but I've not turned up any others that can handle the VR5 engine. So that's my overview. I've really just dumped all of the knowledge I've picked up over the years and that I've done in recent research on the VR5 engine into this video. Please let me know in the comments what you think of it, what things I've missed, what recommendations you would make. But if you're interested in tuning cars, getting the most out of your engine and just what the different performance upgrades are in detail, this really is the channel for you. So please subscribe if you haven't done so, because we would love you to stay tuned. Please boop that like button, because that really does help us to get out there as a recommendation to the algorithm. And I'll see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching.